I'm Sam Worthington, the CEO of InterAction. We all know President Bill Clinton. Yes, he was elected twice, and he oversaw the longest expansion of jobs and the longest economic expansion of some 22 million Americans getting work. But we celebrate here a different aspect of President Clinton. It's a legacy that I think was first embodied when I had the opportunity to meet him after the 2004 tsunami response and again in 2009 in the Haiti response. Today, we know President Clinton because of his work for marginalized people and families who have lost everything. Yes, he served in the White House as our president, but we know President Clinton as an NGO leader who continues to challenge us to explore new ways of working, new ways to impact more lives in very difficult places. After he left the White House, he founded the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, an institution that exists to focus on human welfare, well-being, and collaboration. It has catalyzed partnerships between the private sector, government, and the NGOs. It works to improve health, human well-being, increase opportunities for girls and women, reduce childhood obesity, and it creates economic support and opportunity here at home, like many of you do, and abroad. It also is actively involved in the battle against climate change. Today, Foundation staff and volunteers are spread across the world, and they are applying business-oriented approaches to their work to sustain populations. I've had the opportunity, as of some of you in this room, to join the Clinton Global Initiative, a remarkable effort that has brought together global leaders, and ultimately some 3,600 commitments have improved the lives of some 435 million people around the world. We recognize the importance of President Clinton's legacy. We also recognize and really appreciate the work he has done afterwards and the energy he has brought to our common collective cause of improving the well-being of humanity. Please join me in welcoming President Bill Clinton to the InterAction Forum.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. First, Sam, thanks for the introduction and for having me back to InterAction. I have many friends in this audience, but I do want to acknowledge two people with whom I worked back when we had very different kinds of jobs. Former President Joyce Banda of Malawi, former President Mary Robinson of Ireland. They were good in those jobs, and they're great at what they've done since. And you're going to hear a conversation, I think, in a couple of minutes that will demonstrate that. I want to thank all of you for dedicating your lives to being on the front lines of solving problems and seizing opportunities for people in places that are often ignored, often underfunded, and may or may not, as the case may be, become more imperiled by the decisions of political leaders in this new moment. In 2006, 11 long years ago, it seemed like day before yesterday, I came to the InterAction Forum to thank you for the support that many of you had given to me in the job I took for the UN as Special Envoy for tsunami recovery. It was a remarkable experience, especially in Aceh and Indonesia, which was hardest hit, because the way the recovery was done, one, marked the first major project that Indonesia had undertaken that even 11 years later seems to have been completely free of any form of corruption. Partly because of the leadership the president gave to a remarkable man named Pak Kantoro, and partly because of the system that we developed for total transparency in commitments made, commitments received, what the money was spent on, and an after-action analysis of what the results were. And there were all these ordinary Indonesians, if there is such a thing, in those remarkable 18,000 plus islands, actually keeping up with what was happening to the money and to the lives. And remarkably, when you consider this conflict-filled time we're living in, the way the tsunami was handled led, among other things, to a massive infusion of private investment into Aceh and to an end to a long-standing civil conflict there. The way they worked together, these sides in the conflict, the trust they built in one another, and the fact that they were empowered to make good things happen for themselves, their communities, and their neighbors, had a remarkable positive political impact. At the time, it was the largest ever mobilization of funds for a natural disaster. And money donated to NGOs represented about a third of the total funds. So we had this amazing level of cooperation. We launched the intensive review after that to analyze what the role of the NGOs was, how it fit with everything else. And we announced it 11 years ago here at InterAction. The effort was led by my deputy. Eric Schwartz was supposed to be here today. He just left his job at the Humphrey Center at the University of Minnesota and moved here and came home to, shall we say, a rather typical problem with his home plumbing, so he's not here. How far the mighty have fallen. I lost out to a plumbing problem. He did it along with Sam and InterAction. They did a remarkable job. And they had good partners, the Red Cross, CARE US, International Medical Corps, the IRC, Mercy Corps, Plan USA, Refugees International, Save the Children US, and World Vision. The effort they made to analyze what we had done produced a report that promoted critical lessons that have basically dominated humanitarian responses in areas of significant damage ever since. Among other things, the lessons learned were a guide to best practices that continue to govern the conduct of disasters. I'll never forget, we had a meeting in Germany, I think it was in Bonn, and all these people were there. And we were trying to talk about how this should be done everywhere. And at the time, like now, we weren't getting along so great with Iran. And the representative from Iran was there, and he said, all I know is we got earthquakes and we want it to be handled like the tsunami was. I don't care about the politics. And we had, so he participated, and we talked about the importance of coordination among the NGOs so we didn't fall all over each other, which has dominated every major natural disaster since then, a serious effort to do that. The necessity of reconciling what the NGOs were doing with the home government and with donor governments and donor multinationals. The need to consult the people you're trying to help and pay attention to their priorities and set up systems that will allow them regular access to information so they know whether you're just talking or actually doing what you say you're going to do. The recognition that local economies in the end have to drive their own recovery, and that building local capacity at the national and community level must always be a major focus. So, and that's the only way you can leave people better off than you found them. The whole Build Back Better mantra, which is taken hold over the 11 years since we used it as a slogan for the tsunami area, was essentially rooted in the idea that we had to build capacity. If you do it really well, you wind up with the settlement of a long-standing civil conflict in Aceh. And if you blow it within 4 or 5 years after you leave, everything's just the way it was. So this is really, really important. Finally, we advocated something that's easy to ignore today, but still important, that there be a human rights-based framework for assistance to empower people and to make sure that food, shelter, and treatment are allocated on a non-discriminatory basis. These lessons are now more important than ever. I mean, look at the challenges you're facing. There's still more than 800 million people living in extreme poverty. More than 65 million people have been forced from their homes. More than 11 million Syrians. 1 in every 3 people on the planet has no access to proper sanitation. Still unequal opportunities by gender across the world, although it's getting better in a lot of places. And the pace of climate change is increasing. Species destruction is at about a 10,000-year high. We had another big chunk of the Arctic break off not very long ago. Island nations are all over the world, but especially low-lying nations in the Pacific are already actually threatened. To them, denial of the problem strikes them as unbelievable. So those of us who believe that we live in the most interdependent age in human history and who do the work that we do are clearly justified by the challenges we face. But also we have to take account of the opportunities that are there for people and the criticisms that have been leveled. Because the truth is, we are condemned to share the future, whether we like it or not. No matter how much we badmouth people that don't look like us or think like us, we're stuck with one another. And so the job of every thinking person on planet Earth is to maximize the benefits and minimize the dangers of the most interdependent age in human history. We are driven to interdependence by the realities of the global economy, the internet, mobile technology, the social media. But we know that both positive and negative forces have been released. There's been an amazing explosion of economic, social, and political empowerment. There's also been increasing inequalities in many places, not just in incomes, but in access to employment, to capital, to healthcare, to education. There is a lack of capacity in many places still to deal with the self-evident challenges that make life miserable for untold numbers of people. And increasing vulnerabilities have arisen from our interconnectedness in all kinds of ways. In reaction to the downside and without appreciation of the upside, we have seen a resurgence in the oldest of all social reactions, a tendency to look at people first as the other, to think of life in zero-sum terms. It's us versus them. So my first job is to figure out who is us and who is them. Then I'll know who I'm against. We're laughing, but if you think about it, there was once a sound basis for this way of thinking. When the first humans stood up on the East African savanna, somewhere between 150 and 200,000 years ago, And then families began to form, and clans began to form. And food was scarce. You had to take care of your own first. And there were many zero-sum situations. People began to farm, it sort of abated. But throughout history, there have been, right down to the present day, because of actions taken and attitudes adopted and histories people couldn't escape, actual zero-sum situations. If confronted with them and you ignore them, you could lose your life. On the other hand, every successive age in human history has enabled humanity ever so slowly to expand the definition of us and to shrink the definition of them. So here we are, we got the whole planet at risk because of climate change, which is proceeding more rapidly than ever before, and the consequences of the destruction of natural resources, especially innumerable species on planet Earth that most people don't even know exist now, as well as those they do know, like the elephants, the rhinos, the tigers. But it's also full of enormous opportunity, which can best be seized by diverse groups working together, breaking down barriers that have previously separated them. We actually know if I could wave a magic wand, I could fill this vast room with the social science studies proving that diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones, and certainly better decisions than lone geniuses. If we could wave a magic wand and identify somehow magically the person in this room with the highest IQ and escort you to an adjoining room and give you whatever you wanted for the next 48 hours, to eat, to drink, a cushy place to sleep, and the rest of us were condemned to these chairs, even chained to them, stuck with cold coffee and stale rolls. And over a 2-day period, we feed 10 questions into this room and same 10 questions into the geniuses room. Over 2 days, we'd make better decisions. Those of us stuck with each other, because diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones or lone geniuses. But we can only do it if we move our minds out of thinking everything is a zero-sum game, where in order for us to win, someone has to lose, to positive-sum games in which in order for us to win, somebody else has to win too. And in a world where the resources are finite, and we're going to have to change over time if we're going to 9 billion people on the planet, the way we produce and consume food, just as we first have to face the changes in the way we produce and consume energy, in order that our grandchildren's grandchildren can share this planet in peace with some hope for equal dignity. We're going to have to do this together. Despite the headlines, the trend lines are pretty good. Most everywhere, the death rates are going down for young children. In America, despite all the talk you hear, we actually have historically low crime rates. In spite of all the fear-mongering, the immigrants in America have a lower crime rate than the homegrown population. The murder rate among Muslims, 0.9% of our population, is less than 0.3%, or less than 1/3 the general population. Our diversity is helping us. First-generation immigrants are more than twice as likely to start a new business in this country as those of us who've been here longer. Do we have problems? Oh, yeah, we do. And a lot of them are embedded and slowing down what we should otherwise be doing. But we've got to deal with this in a real way. Broadening the circle of opportunity, sharing responsibilities, feeling a common sense of community is a precondition of doing the work that you try to do in so many specific ways on these issues. You ask no one to give up their unique identity. You ask them to be proud of it, but you have to convince people they can only enjoy what is unique about them and their crowd by respecting and embracing what is unique about others. That's what it means to be interdependent. It's going to be positive or negative or both. And I will say again, that the number one job of everybody on earth, each in our own way, is to increase the positive and reduce the negative forces of interdependence. And it begins with how our minds work. We have to decide whether the only safe path is to go back to us and them and just make sure we win every time, whoever we are and whoever they are. Or whether there is a thread in us which permits us to see and to feel the possibility of sharing the future. This is the great question being faced everywhere today. You tell me a problem anywhere on planet Earth, starting here and going anywhere, and I will be able to reduce it to that. We have never had more potential to spread hope through real learning, through real doing, through the alleviation of pain and the provision of opportunity. But we are passing through a perfectly predictable period of reaction to the rapid rate of change economically and socially all over the world, which leaves a lot of people feeling left out and left behind, economically, socially, even psychologically, feeling that the only response is anger and resentment. Never works, you know. Even if it works today, it falls apart tomorrow. But this is as old as the history of humanity. Imagine us feeling things that were buried in the premortal brains of our ancestors when they first were walking across the East African savanna and saw somebody that didn't look quite like them. Didn't have quite the same loincloth. Wrapped the stones on their sticks differently. I mean, this is a very old deal. And sometimes it is real. That is, these differences sometimes cannot be bridged, but we're in a position now with all this inundation of mass media, when it's hard to sort fact from fiction, or when we actually have a beef, but we got to have some help to solve it, that we don't have the luxury of repeating every mistake every generation for the last 200,000 years has made. We sort of got to figure it out a little quicker than that. That's where you come in. Governments are important. They're important in healthcare. I spent a lot of time after the last election doing what I could and urging others to do what they could to save the global health commitments to the poor, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, because they and the Gates Foundation, those three, provide an enormous amount of the aggregate funding in healthcare. I applaud the countries that have maintained their commitments. And I want to recognize especially Ambassador El Taiba from the UAE. Thank you for being here. They are now the #1 ranked country in the world in the percentage of their GDP that goes to assistance. And we've been friends a long time, and when I met him, he was a dashing young man, and I never thought he would become the benign face of social justice for poor people around the world, but you wear it well, and I thank you. Then we got to think about what we're going to do. What can we do? The thing I have loved these last 16 years working with my foundation is that so much of my life in politics, which I also loved, warts and all, was about, well, what do things look like? Once you get into the business we're in now, it's about what are things really like? What is? Not what does it look like? What is? In all the years I was in politics, people talked about what are you going to do and how much money are you going to spend? And then sometimes how are you going to spend it so it helps you and hurts somebody else? We tend to think about, how much do you have matters, but we tend to think a lot more about whatever you're going to do and however much money you have, how do you propose to do it? How do you propose to do it so that your good intentions and whatever money you have can actually advance the cause you seek to advance, alleviate the problems you seek to alleviate, reduce pain, increase hope. The world would be better served if we, the NGO movement, could convince governments to focus more on the how question too. I find that the how question tends to be a unifying one. One of the most rewarding things we do now with our foundation is a partnership with President George W. Bush and his foundation, where we bring in 60 people every 6 months who are sort of in mid-career, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, of all races, all religions, gay and straight, you name it, everybody. We've got these, and most of these people have never spent any time with people who are diametrically, superficially different from them. And for 6 months, they go from the Bush library to his father's library to the LBJ library to my library, and they study decisions and talk about them. What would you have done in the circumstances? What if this, that, or the other thing were different? How would you handle this? Now, what would you do, knowing what you knew about this problem today? And this is the 3rd year we've done this. We take 60 people every 6 months, and they just get better and better and better. But they are literally shocked to find out sometimes that they actually like somebody that they have spent a lifetime preparing to dislike. When you see, it's like watching blinders. When you watch the them blinders fall away and the us glasses be put on, all you got to do is get them focused on a real person, a real problem, a real thing, and say, now, how are you going to do this? In the class before this was the biggest hoot I had with these two breathtakingly admirable and severely wounded Iraq War veterans. Became friends with a very substantial African-American woman who leads the gay rights movement in Little Rock. In 1,000 years, they never would have imagined themselves joining hands And by the time it was over, these people were crazy about each other. Why? Just because they discovered them as people. And because they moved beyond bloviating to talking about what are we going to do and how are we going to do it. Now, this is really important. I know the UN Development Goals were somewhat controversial among some people. They thought they were too wooden, too specific, too whatever. But in the last few days, I'm sure many of you saw it, there was really a comprehensive analysis made of what was the effect of the Millennium Development Goals. And the conclusion was that they did a lot of good, that people had something to shoot for, and that there were more people alive, especially children. There were more opportunities for young children, especially girls. There was more economic opportunity for the severely poor countries that had aggressively participated in this. And on balance, not only were some of the goals met, a couple exceeded, and progress made in all of them, that the aggregate impact was positive. Because having these goals forced us to think about, how are we going to do this? And a lot of our otherwise seemingly important differences seem to fade away. So now we have these Millennium Development Goals, and I would say to all of you, I understand why people wanted a more comprehensive set of goals. I understand why a lot of people thought the Millennium Development Goals were too wooden. I also understand that if you want to talk big and do little, it's easier to take a dive when you've got more goals than you can meet, and they're very vague. So all of us who care about this have to put meat on those bones. We have to say, this is what we think this one means. This is what we think that one means. This is what we're prepared to do. And the more we do that, the more we will build broad-based support from the governments, whose support is essential in many of the areas we operate. And the more we'll find friends we didn't know we had. One of the most exciting projects that I've been involved in recently is in Rwanda with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, which has been independent. We spun it off in 2010 because all the money in the world was going to healthcare, and they had more money than the whole rest of the foundation combined. And I wanted it to be beyond politics, and we just expanded the board, put more public health advocates on it. But anyway, we worked in Rwanda with the help of a private foundation grant, because I don't take any money from the U.S. government. And USAID has been funding directly the Rwandans to retrain the entire Rwandan healthcare workforce. From everybody that works in every hospital and every clinic, all the community healthcare workers, expand the number of doctors and nurses, the whole 9 yards. We wound up with more than 24 partners. Medical schools, nursing schools, the Yale Health School of Health Management, a lot of others. They are working there. The first 2 years they worked for 7% overhead total. I'm pretty sure they lost money. But they did not want America to be known for taking excessive percentages of overhead anymore. And they were prepared to do it. And finally, we figured they were losing money. We pushed them to take just a little more. I think they're up to 9.5 or something now. But I mean, that's in country and here. But to see this is amazing. Now, you would think such a thing would be very popular in an era of people who say they want everybody to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and all that. It's a bad thing if the government cuts USAID, because it's a little bit of money doing an outsized amount of good. I'm glad that Norway and Ireland and many other countries are going to keep their aid budgets. But the big money, just because of the size of the GDP and because of the distribution, has been in the US and the UK. I'm grateful for what the UAE has done, but to equal what is being proposed as a cutback, we'd have to have all the nations in the region follow suit, and maybe then some. This is a big deal. We say we want people to stand on their feet. We say we want to build capacity. These people are saying, we don't want to take any money to run a really good health system in a country with a low per capita income. We think they're still entitled to good health care. We worked in the beginning just to rebuild hospitals. Every hospital in Rwanda was destroyed in the genocide except the one in the capital, Kigali. The last one in Butaro, which is near the Ugandan border, has the only cancer center in Central Africa. And it's a perfect NGO because the cancer center was paid for by one of America's most famous race car drivers, Jeff Gordon, who just found out about it and thought it was criminal that his children would get good treatment if they had cancer. And when he found out the cancer rates in African children were more or less the same they were everywhere else in developed countries, he built it. They're connected, as all children's hospitals are, to the work at St. Jude so that every advance in human genome discovery immediately is communicated there. These things can be done everywhere. But we can't do it by running away. When the Ebola crisis hit Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, we were about to start CGI, and I said, you know, we need to send some. They desperately need medical supplies. Any of you who know how it works or just watched it closely, watch people taking off all those gloves, all those coverage, new uniform every day, maybe 4 or 5 times a day, depending on how many people you were dealing with. So overnight, Last Mile Health and several of their partners gave the first commitment at that year's global initiative 100 tons. I thought it was pretty good. Didn't cost the taxpayers a penny. Eventually, they sent 500 tons. Why? Because it was the morally right thing to do, because it was a smart thing to do, because we didn't want the epidemic to spread, and we didn't need government to do that. But that was done by people like you, walking NGOs. What we do need governments to do is to give them the money to build health systems so they don't have another Ebola outbreak. They had Ebola in Nigeria. Nigeria is a lot bigger country, could have killed a lot more people, but they had built enough of a healthcare system to identify and isolate and quarantine quickly people who could have been exposed. They lost the very few people and went on with their lives. So in addition to doing our job better, if you want to live in a world of positive interdependence, we have to clearly and more clearly define what the government should do, what the NGO sector should do, and what the private sector can do. When a government steps up as he has to give more money, we should do more better. We should continue to recruit more private sector partners. But we should not pretend that we can build the world that we want to overcome all the negative forces of interdependence with no involvement whatever from the public sector. We can fill gaps, and we can, and I hope will, do things faster, cheaper, and better. And one of the things that I regret about the rise of more authoritarian governments trying to crush and drive out NGOs is they may be able to control the media and tell you everything's hunky-dory, but the truth is they don't do things better. Once you rewrite the rules on science and you deny self-evident facts, and you do what they've done in Russia, for example, which is to crack down on NGOs to an extraordinary extent, the public may get news reports on a controlled media that everything's hunky-dory, but they're not doing things better. Otherwise, Russia wouldn't have a male life expectancy of under 60. It would be 80 or more. So, what I urge you to do is not to grow weary. What I urge you to do is not to be discouraged. What I urge you to do is not to be particularly surprised. I grew up in the rural South in the 50s and 60s. I have heard this song before. I have seen this movie before. And I am part of a clan of people you would love to have as your neighbors if your house caught on fire, because we'd run right in, save your kids, and put the fire out. But you can turn us into fulminating, reactive, us and them people in a bird dog minute by making people feel resentful and looked down on and left out and left behind. I know what's going on. I've been there. I grew up in it. I will be the last American president, I hope, to have ever lived in a home without indoor plumbing. It's a great political story, but it's way overrated, I can tell you that. And especially in the winter when it gets cold and you look down there and there's a snake right there looking at you. But so you got profoundly good people who are just in a total state of resentment and anger all the time. It's a lousy way to live. It doesn't make anything good happen. And my advice is not to get in a shouting match to do it, but try to recreate what we do with this leadership program. Every day, the more you do something good, the more people see it, the less it's deniable, the more we can move back together, the more we can do sensible things. Every time you save a life, every time you stand up for the human rights of people, every time you say, well, you can say whatever you want to about climate change, all I know is that this little country in the Pacific's about to disappear. Every time you do anything in this space, you will increase the necessary, or at least the probability that you get the necessary public support for what you're doing. And you will hasten a day when we will give up the us and them and realize, look, the world we're living in requires us to find positive sum solutions. We have a young diplomat from Colombia here. They have gone through pure hell. And when I started to try to help them at the end of the last my term, 1/3 of the country belonged to the narco traffickers and the people who defended them. People who once had a political agenda long since abandoned. They have now spent 16 years working through it and reclaiming their country. We had the 50th anniversary of the Inter-American Development Bank in Medellin, formerly the home of the biggest cartel in the world. Belongs to the people of Colombia again. So now we're in a snit, and we were talking about it, over the details of the peace plan and how to make them acceptable to all the parties. But the point is, that's the right debate to be having. You want to be not dodging bullets. What you want to do is answering arguments. It's their country again. I've seen, I asked Mary Robinson about our friends in Northern Ireland. I once got in terrible trouble in a country where I was supposed to be popular because of my work for the peace in Northern Ireland, because they were arguing endlessly over the policing and one or two issues, and they wouldn't get it back. And I said, it reminded me of people who are standing in a bar and they decide that they have drunk too much and they will not drink again, And they go out arm in arm until they get to the door and they look at each other and smile and say no, and they go back. I was excoriated for building a stereotype of the Irish. At least I was stereotyping myself, right? And on the front page of the Dublin newspaper the next day, there was I've never seen this done before. There was a bordered letter to the editor saying, by the writer saying, I see where people are condemning President Clinton for comparing us to drunks because we just can't stop fighting with each other. And I'm glad he was condemned. As a lifelong alcoholic, I resent being compared to those people. Which is the last point I want to make. Sometimes the best defense to all this stuff is a little bit of humor. You know, we're all just passing through. The most valuable tool I had as president, at the end of my term, I got in 1999 when we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the moonwalk by an American astronaut. And NASA brought me a vacuum-packed package, you know, it was clear, containing a rock taken off the moon in this moonwalk. It had been carbon dated at 3.6 billion years old. So, you know, when you see the White House and the presidents, they're meeting with people, and there are people on the couches on the side and all that, and there's a little table there. I put the moon rock on the table. And whenever anybody started having a fight and it got a little hot, I said, wait a minute, guys, stop. Look at that rock. It is 3.6 billion years old. We are all just passing through. So we better settle down and get something done. It unfailingly worked. Whenever I'm trying to make a case about climate change or species preservation, I make people read E.O. Wilson's books because he talks about, you know, the whole history of life on planet Earth. The fierce urgency of now in this moment can best be concentrated by people who are not distracted by only temporary emotional, financial, or political victories. So let me close with this. I had the honor to work in President Banda's country on many things, but we had this neat little project where we got a little money to help very poor villages in Malawi earn carbon credits for tree plantings. And there were three. One was in the hottest part of the country. So we go to the villages. We hired a young university graduate, he's only 22 years old, a young Malawian man, and he said, I will do this job if you let me go in and spend a day talking to people about climate change. He said, you think this is about the money to them. This is not. This is about their responsibility to their children, to their grandchildren, to the future of their country. He was amazing, very wise beyond his years. So in the cooler of there were two of these places that were markedly cooler, average temperature than the third. They chose to build, to plant fruit trees because they knew people wouldn't tear them down because they produce money every year. In the third, the hottest place, the village that we visited, they chose a particularly fast-growing form of tree that could be quickly harvested in a sustainable way to build lightweight, airy wooden housing because all these people were in the poorest part of the country and they were all living in mud huts or brick, and they were sweltering almost all the time. So I went there to celebrate. You know, they got the money, they built the houses, and they were still sitting under the trees. And 500 people showed up, and they didn't know who I was from anybody. I was just some old gray-haired white guy trying to help him. I went there because of something entirely different, and this should keep you working and keep you happy and keep you grateful that we have the chance to do this work. So the villagers had picked the wood, right? They're getting the carbon credits. These people live in a place with a per capita income at the time of less than $1 a day. So they said, okay, this is how much money you're going to get. How would you like to spend it? Want to plant more trees, build more houses faster? They said yes, with 55%. Believe it or not, they hit on this with 55% of the money. We want to give 45% of every cash payment we get to the villages near us so they can do what we do. These are people who are living on less than $1 a day, but they were rich enough to see that their future depended upon the general acceptance of the reality of climate change and the general acceptance that everybody deserves a decent place to live and a way to educate their children and the whole 9 yards. And I thought, how many people worth millions of dollars in the same circumstance would make the same decision to share the future with their neighbors? Did they put themselves and their families first? You bet they did. They took 55%. I'd left a lot left over. Money that would not even buy a big lunch at the richest restaurant in many of the world capitals, but it was all the money in the world to them. Those are the people that are out there. Those are the people whose lives deserve to be saved. Those are the people who deserve their children and grandchildren's future. And there's some of that in people that you may think we have to give up on and walk away from. Our job is not to judge anything other than how we can do things faster, quicker, or better. Save and lift more lives. Stop more bad stuff from happening. If we answer the how question, and everyday people see it, it will eventually do all we can do in the positions we now occupy to reduce the definition of them and expand the definition of us. The oldest question of human society is the defining issue in virtually every single solitary important question we face today. And no one has more power to ensure that it will be answered properly than those of us who just walk into any place and see another human being and only wish that everyone could do the same. Thank you. Thank you.